Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Martin returned to Drew's house appearing weary, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of a long day filled with convoluted conversations and unresolved tension. Though his steps were slow and deliberate, there was a persistent restlessness clinging to him, one that no amount of rest could shake. He moved through the foyer absently, letting his fingers trail across the edge of the console table where Drew often left unopened mail, outdated documents, and crumpled sheets covered in crayon doodles from visiting children. As he passed, a peculiar glint of light caught his eye, a corner of parchment protruding slightly from beneath a stack of discarded folders. Something about its placement, about the texture of the paper, aged, slightly yellowed, the ink bleeding faintly through, halted Martin in his tracks. Drew had earlier mentioned that the children had brought in old scraps from the attic of the Quartermain estate, claiming most of it to be meaningless junk, papers from a bygone era. But now, standing alone in the quiet house with only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock accompanying him, Martin felt an odd compulsion stir inside him. A shiver ran down his spine, and the sensation of being watched, or warned, crept up the back of his neck. He reached out and gently lifted the sheet from its hiding place. The moment his eyes scanned the first few lines, he froze. The handwriting was unmistakable, delicate yet firm, with the same distinctive slant and loops he remembered from decades ago. It was a script he had seen in medical records, old journal entries, and formal correspondences during his early years practicing law in Port Charles. But this couldn't be, it was impossible. Martin's hands began to tremble as his eyes fixated on the name signed at the bottom of the page, Leslie Weber. The very same Leslie Weber who had long been presumed dead, whose absence had become a quiet legend whispered in grief behind hospital doors, who had been eulogized, mourned, and buried in collective memory. The mother of Laura, the grandmother of a fractured Cassadine lineage, and once a pillar of G.H. And yet, here she was, or at least her voice was, resurrected through paper and ink in a letter addressed not to Martin, but to Monica Quartermain. As Martin sat down heavily into the armchair nearby, the letter trembled in his grasp like a living entity. His heart pounded in his ears as he continued to read. This was not a simple letter of comfort or a nostalgic reflection from someone on her deathbed. No, this was a confession, a raw, unfiltered cascade of secrets that Leslie had held on to during what she called her stolen years. She explained that she had not died, as everyone believed, but had been forcibly removed from Port Charles and kept in a secured medical facility somewhere in Europe. The place was nondescript and isolated, and she had been told that her silence was necessary, for the good of the hospital, though it quickly became apparent that the true motive was much darker. She detailed the sinister operations she had stumbled upon before her disappearance. Irregularities in patient files, inconsistencies in organ donor documentation, and an unsettling number of patients vanishing after routine treatments. When she began to investigate further, Leslie realized these were not administrative errors, but deliberate manipulations involving falsified death certificates, transferred identities, and even experimental treatments being carried out in secret. And at the center of it all, she wrote, stood Victor Cassadine. A man whose cruelty and cunning ran far deeper than most knew. According to Leslie, Victor had embedded himself into the medical infrastructure at GH years earlier through a web of silent partners, benefactors, and covert operatives who operated under the guise of philanthropy. When Leslie threatened to go public, she was hospitalized and subsequently disappeared. Martin read on, each word landing like a blow to the chest. Leslie expressed deep regret for not reaching out to Monica sooner. She wrote of how many nights she had tried to sneak letters out through sympathetic staff or coded messages in medical documents. Most were intercepted. Only now, by a sheer stroke of fortune, had she been able to slip this letter out through a contact within the clergy. Her voice on the page was lucid but weary, a woman resigned to her fate, yet desperately hoping her message would finally reach the only person she trusted. And then came the paragraph that chilled Martin to the bone. Leslie confessed that she had reason to believe Alan Quartermain's death may not have been the tragic, unforeseen event that Monica had believed for so long. She didn't provide detailed proof, but referenced a hushed meeting between Victor and another man, someone powerful within GH, someone who had access to restricted files and influence over the medical board. She had only overheard part of their conversation, but the intent was clear: contain and silence. Alan, it seemed, had begun to piece together the same dark puzzle that Leslie had, and that made him a liability. The implication that Alan may have been murdered under the guise of natural causes was too horrifying to fully absorb. But the letter did not stop there. In its final passages, Leslie recounted a brief but haunting encounter in a French rehabilitation clinic. While being moved for what was described as routine reassessment, she spotted a man in the hallway who looked strikingly similar to Nicholas Cassadine. His face was partially hidden, and staff quickly ushered him away, but the resemblance was too strong to dismiss as coincidence. Leslie became convinced that Nicholas was involved in the broader conspiracy, or at the very least, was aware of her detainment. Perhaps he had been silenced too, or perhaps, more disturbingly, he was part of the system now. She ended the letter with a plea, not just to Monica, but to anyone who would listen. She begged for the truth to be brought to light, for Laura to be told everything, and for the legacy of General Hospital to be cleansed before more lives were destroyed. As a final breadcrumb, Leslie mentioned a hidden compartment in St. Catherine's Chapel, a modest little church just outside Port Charles, where she had, years earlier, hidden duplicate records, photographs, and testimonies in the hope that one day someone would find them. Martin sat paralyzed, the letter limp in his lap, its contents echoing in his mind like thunder rolling through a canyon. He had stumbled upon a ghost, not in the spectral sense, but in the raw, historical form, a voice resurrected from oblivion to deliver a burden too heavy for any one man to carry. He looked toward the hallway where Drew had exited, and then toward the phone, paralyzed between action and inaction. Should he tell Monica, who might not have the strength to face this storm? Should he show it to Laura, knowing it could shatter her world all over again? Or should he do what so many had done before, bury the truth, and with it, the name Leslie Weber once more? Yet in Martin's heart, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The dead were speaking, and their truth was demanding to be heard. Martin set the letter down, his hand trembling as though it had been scorched by the very truth inked across the fragile parchment. His breath came shallow and unsteady, his shirt clinging to his back with a sudden sheen of cold sweat that had erupted without warning. The silence around him was deafening now, amplifying the steady pounding of his heart as the gravity of what he had just read began to settle over him like a crushing weight. What he held was not merely a dying woman's final words, not simply the wistful reflections of someone lost to time. No, what he had read was a detonating truth, a slow-burning fuse that had been ignited years ago and had finally reached its explosive conclusion in his very hands. This was not just a personal reckoning. It was a revelation capable of shaking the entire foundation of General Hospital and crumbling the legacy it had stood upon for generations. The contents of Leslie Weber's letter were incendiary. If exposed, they would call into question decades of medical practices, administrative integrity, and the ethical standing of the most revered doctors in Port Charles. What had always been seen as a bastion of healing and community service was, according to Leslie, a battleground for hidden agendas, cover-ups, and silence dissent. Her words painted a chilling portrait of a hospital that had, at times, become a pawn in much darker schemes orchestrated from the shadows. The idea that Victor Cassadine had manipulated not only the medical system but the lives and fates of countless patients and staff was staggering in itself. But even more harrowing was the implication that this wasn't ancient history, it was a threat that had never truly gone away. Martin's thoughts quickly turned to Monica. The woman was already physically fragile, her recent health decline apparent to anyone who knew her well. Her emotional resilience had also worn thin in the wake of loss, betrayal, and the unrelenting pressure of maintaining the Quartermain family legacy. How could she possibly endure the knowledge that her old friend, someone she had loved and grieved for, had not only been alive all this time but had suffered in silence, alone, tormented by secrets she had no one to share with? The psychological trauma of that truth would be like a blade to Monica's soul, reopening old wounds and tearing through every last defense she had left. Martin could see her face now, disbelief turning to horror, and then perhaps to something even more irreversible, resignation. He feared that this revelation could kill her. Not with violence, but with heartbreak. And yet, despite the enormity of the risk, Martin knew he couldn't simply bury the truth again. That had been the mistake of so many before him, looking the other way, rationalizing silence as protection, confusing cowardice for mercy. As he sat frozen in that realization, he weighed his options. Should he keep the letter to himself, investigate Leslie's claims in secret, gather proof before delivering such a catastrophic truth to those who needed to hear it? Or should he immediately alert Laura, the daughter left behind, who had never stopped loving her mother and deserved to know that her grief had been built on lies? Whatever path he chose, he understood with chilling clarity that there was no undoing this. The truth was now a living, breathing force, and whether he acted on it or not, it would find a way to emerge. It always did. Just as he leaned forward to place the letter inside his briefcase for safekeeping, a distant and seemingly unrelated event was unfolding that would soon entangle itself with Martin's inner turmoil. At that very moment, across town, Laura Collins sat in her office at City Hall, surrounded by legislative documents and civic briefings. A nondescript manila envelope, lacking a return address, had arrived earlier in the day and been placed innocently among her afternoon correspondence. The mayor was accustomed to all manner of letters, requests, complaints, even thinly veiled threats, but something about this envelope unsettled her. Its weight was unusual, and when she finally peeled it open, what fell into her lap rendered her speechless. Inside was a pristine photocopy of the same letter Martin had just read, every word duplicated, every signature mirrored. It was accompanied by a single photograph, a black-and-white image of a younger Laura standing beside her mother in front of the old chapel at St. Catherine's, a place long forgotten by most, but etched deeply in her heart. There were no instructions, no explanation, not even a note. But none was needed. The message was clear. Someone wanted her to know. Someone had risked everything to make sure this truth found its way to her. The emotional reaction was instantaneous. A wave of heat surged through Laura's chest before dissipating into an icy numbness that left her feeling hollow and breathless. Her hands clenched the edges of the photograph as tears welled in her eyes, not out of joy, but out of sheer devastation. If this was real, if her mother had indeed been alive, imprisoned, silenced, and only now reaching out in desperation, it meant everything she had believed about Leslie's disappearance had been a lie. The guilt crashed over her in torrents. Why hadn't she searched harder? Why had she accepted the explanation so readily? And above all, how had she missed the signs? Laura's first instinct was to act. She composed herself long enough to summon Police Commissioner Jordan Ashford and instructed her to reopen the long-closed case file on Leslie Weber's disappearance. She wanted every detail re-examined. Every record, every witness, every unexplored lead. She also demanded that the grounds of St. Catherine's Chapel be swept from foundation to steeple. The letter had referenced a hidden compartment, perhaps containing evidence, perhaps containing nothing at all, but Laura would not leave a single stone unturned. She owed her mother that much, and more. As the wheels of action began turning behind the scenes, Laura sat alone for a long time, staring at the letter's final lines. The image of her mother, isolated in some cold, clinical facility, writing words of desperation that might never be read, it would haunt her forever. And though the truth had finally found its way into the light, it brought no peace. It brought only the first echoes of a reckoning that was long overdue. What Laura didn't yet know was that others had received pieces of the same truth, and that Port Charles was on the brink of unearthing a darkness that had festered in its roots for far too long. What had begun as a letter would soon become a fire, and no one, not even those who thought themselves protected, would escape the burn. At General Hospital, the air had begun to change, subtle at first, like a shift in barometric pressure before a hurricane. Portia Robinson felt it immediately. It wasn't just the usual tension of a hospital dealing with overcrowded ERs and overstretched staff. It was something denser, something historical, something that seemed to hum beneath the fluorescent lights and sterile white walls. She had spent the better part of her career trusting the foundations this place was built on: compassion, integrity, and science. But now, after exposing Drew Kane's manipulation and his orders to falsify medical records, Portia could no longer look at General Hospital with untainted eyes. She had torn off a corner of the veil, only to realize that behind it was an abyss of unanswered questions, echoing with decades of silenced voices. She hadn't expected to feel alone after doing the right thing. But she was. Colleagues who once greeted her with warmth now avoided her gaze. The board members' praise was quiet, cautious, as if uncertain whether to reward her or reprimand her. And yet, even in that state of fragile isolation, Portia remained steadfast. She knew she had to pursue the truth. What she didn't yet grasp was that the truth was more dangerous, more expansive, and more intertwined with the hospital's legacy than she had imagined. When the rumors began, hushed, breathless words behind half-closed doors, about a letter sent from beyond the grave, her curiosity turned to unease. Leslie Weber. The name was sacred in the halls of G.H. A pioneer. A healer. A woman whose death had marked the end of an era. But now, she had returned in the most unexpected way, through a letter, handwritten and saturated with truths no one was ready to hear. The letter had already reached Martin Gray, and Laura Collins had reportedly received a copy as well. Portia's hands shook slightly as she stared at the internal memo that confirmed it. It wasn't just a letter of remembrance. It was a confession. A warning. A posthumous scream for justice. And suddenly, everything Portia thought she understood about her hospital, her colleagues, even her own sense of moral clarity, was cast into a new and unnerving light. Leslie had apparently known of secret experiments, falsified deaths, administrative corruption that traced back decades. Her words named names, questioned revered deaths like Alan Quatermain's, and painted Victor Cassadine as a ghost puppeteer, manipulating lives from the shadows. Isaiah Gannon, her confidant, her emotional anchor in these chaotic days, stood beside her, equally shaken. Though he projected calm to the outside world, Portia could see the storm in his eyes. He too had begun to feel the weight of unspoken histories pressing in on them. How many of their patients had been victims of these conspiracies? How many charts had they signed, unwittingly validating a lie? Isaiah asked few questions out loud, but the silence between them was electric with fear and responsibility. If even a fraction of Leslie's claims were true, they were dealing not just with a scandal, but with institutional betrayal on a scale that bordered on the unthinkable. Elsewhere, Sonny Corinthos moved like a man being hunted. The investigation into Marco Rios's disappearance was closing in, and though Sonny had dealt with greater dangers in the past, something about this felt different. His name was being dragged through media cycles and whispered in backroom negotiations. Ada Turner was on the offensive, law enforcement watching his every move. But what Sonny didn't yet understand was that the true threat had nothing to do with Marco. It was the letter, the truth spilling out from the past, cracking open buried coffins and long-forgotten sins. This letter had the potential to dismantle everything. Not just reputations, but the networks of power that protected people like Sonny and shielded secrets like the ones now emerging from Leslie Weber's ghostly return. And yet, despite all that Portia had seen and done, the funeral preparations for Leslie were moving forward with pomp and ceremony. The city prepared to honor a legacy, even as that very legacy was being rewritten by the ink in her final message. The chapel where the service would take place was being adorned with white lilies and navy sashes, her favorite colors, they said. Doctors rehearsed eulogies. Politicians arranged their condolences. But to Portia, it all felt like a lie. How could anyone speak of Leslie Weber in the past tense now, knowing she had still been alive long after they had buried her memory? How could they mourn her without acknowledging that she had tried to scream for help, and no one had listened? Portia found herself pacing in her office, unable to concentrate, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined Leslie's frail hands gripping a pen in a cold European facility, writing in fear, in hope, in desperation. She imagined the heartbreak Leslie must have felt, thinking that Monica, her friend, might never see the truth. And now, with Monica's health in such a fragile state, the very truth that could vindicate her might also break her. It was a cruel paradox, and one that left Portia feeling helpless. Determined not to let the letter fade into myth, Portia contacted Laura. She offered her help, her access, her time. Laura was already working with Jordan Ashford to reopen the investigation into Leslie's disappearance. Forensic teams were on their way to St. Catherine's Chapel to search for the hidden compartment Leslie had alluded to, if it existed. And even if they found it, who knew what condition those supposed documents might be in? Molded, illegible, destroyed by time or worse, removed by someone who had already anticipated this unraveling.